Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I want to talk about this Confederate officer who is largely forgotten in history. His name is John Augustine Washington III. And yes, the last name connects him to George Washington. He's the great grandnephew of Washington. And he was the last owner of Mount Vernon, the last Washington to own Mount Vernon. He inherited it through the family. Back in the late 1850s, when he sold Mount Vernon to an association, a philanthropic charity created to buy the home called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, he was pilloried in much of the press for turning over Mount Vernon to an organization to selling it out of the family. This kind of thing just wasn't done during that time. The idea of national historic sites was in its infancy. In fact, the US government and state governments wouldn't have the kind of infrastructure and governmental support that they do today. That would come in the early 20th century, not the 19th century. And so Washington's name was dragged through the muck in the newspapers for selling out. In fact, he was really doing a good thing because to support a house of that size, 11,000 square feet, all the land was a big undertaking. And still, although there was a lot of land, the estate had dwindled quite a bit in property because over the generations, as it was carved up and parceled out for inheritances, the small amount of land that was left, though significant, couldn't support the upkeep for the house. So he could be called a man ahead of his time. In 1861, his name is dragged across the newspapers again in September of 1861. By this time, he's a lieutenant colonel and an aide on the staff of Robert E. Lee, one of two personal aides. And at Cheat Mountain in Western Virginia, Lee, a little reluctantly, sent Washington with Rooney Lee, his son, on a reconnaissance of the Union lines. Lee's reluctance was because Washington was inexperienced, perhaps overeager to get out there and have a military experience. Lee, in fact, had turned down Washington on numerous occasions, but this time he said, yeah, go for it. And they went out and ran into trouble. In fact, if you read newspaper accounts, what happened on that reconnaissance is stories are all over the place. Bushwhackers shot him, a whole bunch of Union soldiers shot him. It's all over the place. But what really happened, to the best of my research, is that a company E of the 17th Indiana Infantry, was out ahead of the front lines on picket, and a small detachment, about 10 men from Company E, fanned out. 3 of those men fired the shots when they encountered Washington, Rooney Lee, and a couple of other cavalrymen in support, came up rather closely as they were winding their way down a twisted mountain path, pretty much came right up on the 3 men from the 17th Indiana. The 17th Indiana soldiers had almost no time to react. And their first reaction when they saw Washington and Rooney Lee, not knowing who they were and seeing the other 2 men, they thought that the gray uniforms connected them to one of their brother regiments, the 6th Ohio Infantry, that wore gray. So there was a moment of confusion, and they realized that, no, these are not Buckeyes, these are Confederates. And so they took aim and they fired. And I was able to find a photograph, thanks to Rick Brown, who was one of our senior editors. I found a photograph of the sergeant, John Jacob Weiler. He was the man in charge of that detachment of 10 men, and he and two others fired shots, 3 shots that all struck Washington as he was attempting to flee, hit him in the back, a mortal wound. He died shortly after being taken into captivity. Rooney Lee escaped without injury and made his way back to Lee. Now, word of this shooting and word of the death of a Washington became news on both sides of the country. All of the muck and the mud that Washington was dragged through a few years earlier was still fresh in the minds of many folks in the North. And of course, in the South, the loss of a Washington hit everyone quite hard. I was stunned by the quotes I found in newspapers. Such a controversial, polarizing figure. I don't think I've encountered anyone that pulled such a love and such a passion as a blessed martyr on the southern side and declared a vile traitor on the northern side. I have to read some of these quotes from newspapers and letters to give you a sense of how vivid and how intense the feelings were. So I'll start with the northern press. Here is the Lafayette Courier, September 24th, 1861. Quote, "Thus has gone the name of Washington, the last inheritor, a traitor to the government, the great father of his country, labored to construct, in open rebellion against it, dodging the valiant men who were endeavoring to perpetuate it. He is shot in the back. 'Tis a text for a volume." Here's another one from the Daily Milwaukee News, September 25th, 1861. Quote, "Few tears will be shed at the death of John A. Washington. His character as a sordid, mean man stands boldly forth in contradiction to the patriotic and self-sacrificing Everett." Everett being the philanthropists who spoke, the statesman who spoke at the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery with Abraham Lincoln a couple years later. The quote continues, "One sold the remains of George Washington and the other labored for the purchase money. John A. Washington was a disgrace to Virginia, and dying, his death disgraced her sacred soil. Of him can it be said that he died unwept, unhonored, and unhung. My wish is that the memory of the great immortal Washington will not be insulted by laying the bones of the wretched namesake upon any portion of Mount Vernon. The distance between the burial places should be continents. He deserves no resting place in the United States, save it be at Charleston, South Carolina." One more. The Indianapolis Journal, Indianapolis, Indiana, home state of the 17th Indiana, who gets credit for the shooting. Here's what they had to say. Quote, "Since the commencement of the rebellion that the government is now engaged in quelling, the death of no armed traitor has afforded more satisfaction to patriots than that of John A. Washington. Having made merchandise of the bones of the father of his country and acquired a fortune by selling the ground on which repose the ashes of the great dead at a price fixed at his own avarice, he takes up arms against the government that the patriotism of George Washington founded and seeks to wrest it by force from the possession of those to whom he has transferred it, the liberty-loving people of the United States, who revere the immortal memory of the first president of the Republic. John A. Washington disgraced the name he bore, and we are proud that Indiana has the honor of sending to the battlefield a soldier that killed so vile a traitor. The soldier who performed the deed should have honorable mention on the historic page of the Hoosier State." Now, as I mentioned, in the South, quite a different story. The Southern press held out hope that Washington was alive until his remains arrived on a train in the Confederate capital on September 19th, just a week after he was killed. The Richmond Dispatch portrayed Washington's reconnaissance as a daring ride within a short distance of the enemy invaders of the home state, observing, quote, "He has fallen a blessed martyr in the just and sacred cause of his country, and a grateful people will enroll his name among those who have fallen in defense of the dearest rights." Robert E. Lee professed express his sorrow, his profound sorrow and grief to a friend on September 14th, just 2 days after the killing. It's the same day that he received Washington's remains in camp. Lee said, quote, "The country has met with a great loss in his death. Our enemies have stamped their attack upon our rights with additional infamy by killing the lineal descendant and representative of him who, under the guidance of Almighty God, established them and, by his virtues, rendered our republic immortal." 2 days after that, Lee wrote a beautiful letter to Augustine Washington's eldest daughter, Louisa, who had recently lost her mother, and now both her mother and father were gone. Lee wrote to Louisa, quote, "My intimate association with him for some months has more fully disclosed to me his great worth than double so many years of ordinary intercourse would have been sufficient to reveal. We have shared the same tent, and morning and evening has his earnest devotion to Almighty God elicited my grateful admiration. He is now safely in heaven, I trust, with her he so loved on earth. We ought not to wish him back." And so there's the story of the controversial, polarizing John Augustine Washington III. His full story is in the most recent issue, the current issue of Military Images magazine. I've dropped the link below in the post. So if you want to check it out and get the full story, please do. Take care. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.